Welcome to the Shepherd's Cast. This content may not be suitable for some listeners. Good morning, good evening, and good night, my flock. Welcome to the Shepherd's Cast, the podcast where I read my short stories and explain the inspiration for why I wrote them. Before we get into that, though, I have some announcements. First of which, this is not a short story. I know I just said it was, but it is not. Today we're going to be teasing the first couple chapters of my upcoming novel, Heaper. I think this is a good opportunity for all of you to get to meet the characters that I've talked a lot about and really get into some of my long-form content. Because after all of you have heard this point is short stories. You haven't heard my in-depth detail, my in-depth world building, and that's all something I'm very excited to share with you. And a lot of the first two chapters and the prologue of this story are specifically world building and character development. You get to see the contrast between Dorvin and Tira and the dystopian world that they live in. I'm very excited that you finally get to meet them. I think these are my two favorite characters that I've ever written in any story because I have written so much about both of them. I'm looking at the manuscript now. I finally have it in a formatted version that I'm using for the last edit. Yes, you heard me right. I am on the last edit. We will be moving to publishing with this immediately following Nightmares of a Shepherd. The formatted version of this is 675 pages in a 6x9 format. So we're already talking a massive book. So you can only imagine the amount that I've talked about these two. And this 40-minute reading segment is covering 2 of 42 chapters, I think. They're very long, extensive chapters. And speaking of publications and things of that sort, I'd like to talk about what's been going on. You guys haven't heard from me for a few weeks since the season finale of the podcast, and even at the season finale, I didn't even talk to you guys afterward. Here's what's going on. The last couple weeks, I have been in crunch time. We've gotten the back cover mostly done. I've formatted a lot of the manuscript, and we are working on editing the manuscript. Editing is the last thing that needs to be done before it moves off to publishing. With that also, we have a website. The website is up and functional. You can see it at theshepherdcast.wixsite.com/the-shepherd. Again, that's theshepherdcast.wixsite.com/the-shepherd. There you will see everything about the podcast, the upcoming publications, about the author section, and there is a blog section, which I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do with yet. But it's there. And you can see all my social media links there. Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, Audible, Twitter, /X, whatever you want to call it, Reddit, TikTok. It's all there. And eventually there will be links to the books in the publication section where you can find them on Amazon. And I haven't quite figured out what I'm doing with merch yet, but I believe we're going to do t-shirts with the art for the first short story collection on it that says The Shepherd's Cast, and underneath that it's going to have Nightmares of a Shepherd. I'm really excited for those. Really excited. I think that's about it I have to cover. This is me more or less telling you I'm still alive and putting this bonus episode out for some time filler to buy me more time. I still have a lot of work left to do. The edit is going to take an extreme amount of time, so please be patient. I have started working on Vim, and I have another project I'm excited to announce coming up, but more on all that later. We will come back and do another teaser for this, I think, in a couple weeks. I have some really cool parts of the story I'd like to share preemptively as a marketing ploy to get people interested. But for now, enjoy this part of the story. Enjoy the introduction of our characters and our world in Heaper. Prologue. Across Contaminos, unblessed cities have developed technologies they barely comprehend. That is, they misunderstand how it can benefit the greater good. Yet, they are not blamed for their misunderstanding. Repurposing is in the essence of the river's flow within every tabloid, and those with such desirable skills should not be discouraged. Eco prides itself on supporting the opposite. As an organization devoted to the betterment of the species, the organization offers a trade. Any settlement or city with innovations that aid Eco's quest to rid the planet of the pollution that corrupts us all shall be blessed with an abundance of supplies in the 141 codes of law. In addition, a brigade of sentencers and enforcers will be stationed in the city as upholders of the code and cleansers of corruption. The preamble to the Eco Code. "Sentencer! Sentencer!" cried the crowd of fragmentous tabloids, each of them desperate to catch the attention of the white-cloaked man who had taken the podium. A confusion stemming from the chaotic scene before him left him momentarily paralyzed, unable to choose. This was due to his inability to distinguish one Lloyd from another. It wasn't because the crowd lacked diversity, it was quite the opposite in fact. Each person's colorful flesh and bioluminescent glow contrasted so greatly that the very word diversity lacked meaning in the context. He settled on a woman who was a bright crimson, which mirrored his own color. However, her glow, which ran between the creases of her hexagon-patterned skin, was a searing white, while his was a cool, sorrowful blue. The woman he selected adjusted her suit jacket and clicked play on her vintage tape recorder. "Senator Aldridge, I am Pellanine Lotz, reporting for the Daily Fragment." She spoke with the stereotypical, breathless urgency of a journalist and rushed to fit as many words as she could into one breath. The haste in her voice was yet another example of Sender media making its mark. Specifically, Sender films, which were rare and required a working television, made this trope popular. As she continued, the rest of the crowd hushed, anticipating her question. "This is the first public statement since the induction of Amendment 142. Is this something that the public should be concerned about?" Sentencer Aldridge tightened the orange belt around his white, sleeveless trench coat, cleared his throat, and leaned into the rusted bent microphone. His voice, sharp and nasal, was amplified by the two battered speakers hanging in the corners of a wooden arch, which was just over top of the front of the stage. "Eco has no concerns. The concern is coming from all of you, the writers who question us publicly." That nasal tone was accentuated by his long, crooked nose. "Senator! Senator!" cried the crowd again. This time, he chose a green hex gentleman with a yellow glow. In most cases, the hexagon-patterned skin of a tabloid ended at the neck, leaving the face untouched. However, this reporter's tessellation crept up the underside of his chin, forming a shared edge with his wiry goatee. "Quilphibian Fragmenta Underground," he said, speaking as quickly as Pellanine. "Our concerns are valid. Amendment 142 lacks sufficient restrictions regarding who can enforce the code. Would you not agree there has been a huge surge in code abusers?" His statement dripped with political entitlement. "We have always had issues with code abusers," replied Aldridge coolly. "Even before Amendment 142, there were abuses, and as always, those who were caught for abusing the code are repurposed." "Sentencer! Sentencer!" Fragmenter's sentencer was growing tired of all the questioning. It implanted into his mind the reason as to why he stopped making public statements in the first place. He buried his regret once more, and selected a purple-hexed boy who looked far too young to be asking questions. "Hi, I'm Billy Fodlin from Fragmenta Secondary Training Facility. He tried to speak quickly and confidently, but nervously stumbled over his own words. I think that some people, especially those who are currently studying eco-history, are afraid that if things go unchecked, we may revert to old eco ways. Yes, child. The sentencer wasn't agreeing, simply offering sarcasm to the boy. What a blunt observation. Of course, if people are trading life for life, it would be just like old eco. However, old eco has been gone for some time, hasn't it? Tell me, do you see mass graves, public executions, a war with those outside the city? I think what the boy is getting at, interrupted another man, stepping forward from the crowd. His orange hexes blended in with the sand, and it took a moment for the sentencer to spot him, is that we are all tired of hearing the horror stories, the grease knives, which is Fragmenta's greatest sword of Amendment 142 enforcers, are rumored to be reverting to their prophet's cultish ways. Getting rid of them was the only thing old eco did correctly. Aldridge narrowed his eyes. The knives have indeed had a history with junkyard deities, but Grit, the current overseer and the prophet's son, does not follow that path. He'd rather make tabs upholding the code than follow in the prophet's path of war. But what about the disappearances? Called out a voice from the back. I assure you that each case has been reviewed by me or the chief enforcer. They are resolved with a scooping, an official repurposing plea, or a justified killing statement. The barrage of questions was beginning to make the sentencer anxious. He knew that his statement was a lie, a jab at his own greed, but the purpose of the conference was to diffuse tension, not to let the citizens become aware of the truth. He was getting paid to keep the disappearances hidden, and forgery had become second nature. If Eco City had learned about the increased percentage of code abusers in the area, he would be repurposed himself. What about the increased sightings of Red Rivers amongst the 142 officers? Shouted an enraged reporter. The pressure became too much, and the sentencer cracked. Rumors! These are all rumors that all of you have started. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control, but one of his eyes was twitching. Regardless, he continued onward with his statement. I understand that Eco has been distant lately, but I assure you this, you are in good hands. However, due to the overwhelming skepticism regarding our hired enforcers, I will try to appease you all. Fragmenta will be reinforced, and I will personally oversee all public sentences. Just know that the mission to contact the senders is being disrupted by this nonsense. With that, he backed away from the podium and angrily walked off the stage. 1. Tira. Code 3. To aid the organization in its mission to contact the senders, Eco reserves the right to employ professional scavengers and engineers trained to fulfill its repurposing objectives within the wasteland. These professionals shall be designated as Heapers. To reverse engineer Tira Flask, the code was a way of life. So willing she was to follow it in hopes for bigger and better things, but sometimes the code stretched in ways she didn't understand. For example, Scrap Heaper Dwarven Follid, her heaping partner, was a stretch of the term professional. As he entered the crawler laboratory, a strenuous day of heaping behind him, he placed a dusted red salvage save on the lab station in the center of the room. The save crunched against the plastic-coated metal mesh from which the countertop was made. I brought the tabs today, T, he said, moving away from the counter and grabbing a mug of hot clear. It was perched on the edge of a different lab station to the left of the entry, waiting for his arrival. Correction, I have made the tabs today, said Tira. She placed her rosy, pink-colored hand onto the palm-shaped metal groove in the center of the save. The save clicked as she turned her hand clockwise, rotating the groove. The 4 chains attached to the metal hand piece released and fell to the table. The salvage save's dirty red cloth fell open, revealing a mound of scrap. Twisted and piled halfway to the ceiling, the mound seemed much too large to fit in the cloth that it called home. Come on, T, said the heaper. We're partners in this. I heap and bring salvage and you work your RE magic. We split 50-50 like always. He took one quick sip from the hot clear, winced at its strength, and placed the mug back down on the station. On his face a sly smile was spread from ear to ear. Tira lifted a bent, rusted metal pipe which appeared to have come from an old sender vehicle and threatened it in his direction. "Dorvin, listen to your own advice. I have been cutting you a break to pay off the knives." The aggressiveness dropped from her tone and returned to her proper pitch, which was educated and reminiscent of what the senders called an English accent. "You owe me 70% for the next 3 months, so take your 50-50 and shove it." She sighed and put the pipe into a small pile where she had collected the rest of the metal from the heap. "Also, reverse engineering is not magic. I trained for many years to do this. Sometimes I question why I still work with you." "Why do I still work with him?" she questioned to herself. "He's a source of constant chaos in my life, and is constantly returning from his heaping runs covered in filth." Today's heap was no different. The heaper's curly black hair was dropping grains of orange sand all over the floor, and the creases of his hexes, which covered the entirety of his scrawny, short body, were caked with a stench that Tira could hardly bear. It had dulled his red river, and his swarthy hexes were darker than their normal mocha hue. "I'm the only one who would take you, T," said Dorvin playfully. "Right, I did not have a choice," remembered Tira. When Heapers finished their training, they were assigned a date to select their engineer in a process known as the matching. As if it were a sender speed dating competition, they moved from table to table, interviewing others, looking for a Lloyd they could repurpose with. Tira was the only woman at any of the 3 matchings she went to, and was not selected by a single Heaper. At least, that was until Dorvin sought her as his first choice. During their time speaking at the interview, Dorvin skipped all the normal questions and tried to dig for personal details, which did nothing but make Tira uncomfortable. This caused Tira to seize, and when she explained to Dorvin that she had trouble expressing herself, Dorvin's smile had grown wide. "I've got the Red River, and still, I might not be the biggest mess in this place," he had said. Dorvin must have taken Tira's recount as silent anger. "I'm sorry, you're right," he said, breaking her from her flashback. "I have been irresponsible with our tabs lately. This crawler was a huge setback. I dodged grit for a few months. I didn't split our money evenly, and I fucked up a lot." His run-on caused a moment of shame, and he dropped his head down to the pile of scrap in front of him. His organizational skills were minimal at best. "You forgot the money you blew on scrapper girls," replied Tira, reminding him of his sex addiction. They both laughed. Even though Tira was proper and educated, her dry sense of humor and willingness to point out the obvious were always enough to break any sort of tension between them. She understood that he was a mess, and that most Heapers were. Living day by day, heaping from the most rank places she could imagine could only give so much mental stability. Plus, she had grown more comfortable with the Heaper once she had learned more about him. "Look," she said, breaking the laughter, "you are muddy and smell like shit. The scrapper girls are not going to touch you if you go to the lounge. I know they are trashy, but—" she eyed him up and down. "Not that trashy, so go clean yourself and I will keep—" She reached her hand up, placed air quotes above her head, and changed her tone to match his light, charismatic voice. "Working my RE magic." He continued laughing as he placed a piece of garbage down on the dwindling pile. A sudden realization must have struck him, because as he began to walk out of the lab and into the clean room, he shot Tira with a look of wide-eyed excitement. "I almost forgot!" he exclaimed. "The save isn't even the highlight of the day." She looked up with puzzled expression, which caused him to smirk and toss a plastic bag from his leaden sleeveless vest onto the counter. It contained hundreds of small aluminum can tabs. "What is this, Dorvin? You have been holding out." She picked up the bag, her expression showing a mixture of relief and excitement. It fluctuated her proper nature, and her statement came out with a faltering accent. "We can pay off grit, and have enough left to heap elsewhere." "No need," Dorvin replied smugly. "That's what's left after I paid grit." The excitement vanished, sucked out of the room by the ventilation of the lab. "You heaped with grit?" "Come on, don't be a coder. He came to check on the loan. I already stumbled upon a monster heap. I paid him, and I brought back the rest." As he spoke, he removed his vest and hung it on the metal hook near the clean room, which was made from braided metal wire. Tira gazed at his bare back for a moment. The beautiful hive pattern was disrupted by an old injury that stretched from his left shoulder to his right hip. A scar had formed from whatever had caused it, and the center of his spine a few hexagon patches were missing. She knew that the scar and the Red River had something to do with his childhood in the canyon, and that was only because Dorvan had assured her on the first day of their partnership that he was not a red linker. "He's an Amendment 142 enforcer, Dorvan," said Tira, still staring at the closed wound. "You know, for a fact, if you did not have the tabs, he would have left you for the beats." "But I did have the tabs. Now we can go anywhere you want. To the city north of pirate territory, to the Great Phil, to the east, to the Crank House." He trailed off, thinking of another enticing officer to add to the list. "Wherever, T. It doesn't really matter." Before she could respond, he closed himself behind the door to the clean room. She shouted through the metal barrier between them. "We are not going to the Crank House so you can blow our money on classier scrapper girls." He had added that place as a jab, and she knew it. "Can't hear you. There's a really high-quality steel door in the way." She shook her head and smiled. After all, Dorvan had returned with a great heap, and Grit was paid off for the crawler. For the first time in months, she felt the ease of not having the pirate enforcer breathing down her neck. As she exhaled a sigh of relief, she took in the sight of the crawler. It wasn't Butch, but it was now officially theirs. The inside of the crawler consisted of 4 chambers. The large one, in which she currently stood, was the heaping room. The plastic-coated mesh table in the center of the 15-foot chamber was meant for sorting scrap. Underneath it, there were various drawers labeled with different component names. Around the perimeter of the room, there were 4 stations for scrap repurposing. The first, which was directly to the left of the entrance, was the scrap smelter. The smelter's flat, red metallic surface was rusted and had a crucible inlaid in the center. Hanging on the side were various molds to pour the metal into. It resembled a mess of pot and pans hanging from a cooking station. Dorvan's half-full mug of hot clear helped reinforce this image in Tira's mind. Next to it was the soldering station. The workshop table was attached to the curved dome of the crawler. Lining the dome, behind the workshop, a molded pegboard was affixed. Multiple tools hung from it in an organized manner, dangling loosely over the table's surface, which had 2 soldering irons. They plugged neatly into the circular outlet underneath the station, which was powered by repurposed solar panels on the outside of the crawler. To the right of both stations, and across from the entrance, there were 3 doors. They cut the roundness of the room into a half circle. The door to the right was Dorvan's quarters. The room on the left belonged to Tira, and finally, the one central to both, was the clean room. On the right from the entrance, there were 2 nearly identical stations. Each had a sheet press for recycling plastics and rubbers, and were fitted with thermometers to monitor the components inside. Once heated to the appropriate value, the press would extrude sheets of the appropriate part. The rest of the crawler had miscellaneous knobs and switches mounted on its pointed dome shape. Most of these were unused pieces of circuitry left over from the senders. According to the paint on the outside of the crawler, it was a shuttle used by a company that started with the letters NA. The rest of the acronym was stripped. Regardless of its previous use, the shuttle was now mounted onto 3 large robotic legs, nearly 20 feet in length. Heapers had adapted the term crab sticks due to their ability to step over piles of scrap like long-legged mesa crabs. Tira took a deep breath, her first step in initiating the repurposing process, and began moving the organized piles of scrap to the workstations around the room. At the crucible, she reached for the underside and ignited the mounted blowtorch. As it heated, she placed multiple different metals of the same type into the opening in the center of the station. Then, she did the same with the blowtorches under the sheet presses. While all 3 stations heated the crawler to a nearly unbearable temperature, she began using the tools along the soldering station to strip old wires of their rubber insulation. Sweat poured from her forehead and trapped itself in the white glow of her dimples, which were the only 2 hexagons visible on her nearly smooth face. She caught a glimpse of herself in the reflective surface of the workstation. Her wavy red hair was tied neatly into a bun on the back of her head, and her eyes, which were equally as red, looked exhausted from lack of progress. A distracted hand placed the stripping tool back down and forced herself to contemplate Dorvan's idea. "Maybe moving north is the best thing for my career," she thought. It was a reasonable assumption. Selling to Eco-Flank was going nowhere, and the demand for scrap and fragmenta was drastically dropping. Also, They had rejected her 4 times for engineering roles within the facility. She was unsure of their reasoning, since she was top of her class at Scrapforge Academy for the entirety of her education. She bit her lip because she knew it was a lie she was telling herself. She was fully aware of the reason. Eco was openly and blatantly sexist, and had never hired a woman for anything more than a scrap heaper or a secretary. However, a small bit of her hope that they would look past her body and see the skill it contained. Frustrated, she tried to reinitialize her process, but just as she was about to resume the insulation removal, a discolored component caught her eye. A singular wire was coated in a thin layer of viscosity. She picked it up and studied the wetness. A red blood trail had started down the grooves of her pink skin, covering the white bioluminescence of her river. Her mind immediately wandered to the worst. Had Dorvin accounted a beat? Had Grit injured him and forced the tabs they owed out of his hands? More importantly, did he even pay Grit at all? Worried, but trying to maintain focus, she set the wire off to the side and continued her tasks, annoyed that Dorvin was hiding something. The blood would be a conversation for when he returned. 2. Dorvin. Exhausted from his day of heaping, Dorvin flung his clothes onto the floor, ignoring the rusted red barrel in the corner of the room, specifically for dirty garments. He decided that Tira's anger was less exhausting when compared to bending over. Instead, he obtained his toiletries from a repurposed shelf made of PVC board and strode to the far left corner of the room. There, where the metal sink jutted from the wall, he began his nightly routine, which started with him cleaning his teeth. He turned the knobs to the spigot, causing the pump in the water supply to activate. When it did, the water traveled the pipes, which were sloppily attached to the ceiling. A steady stream of water dripped onto his head as it reached the sink. A tornado couldn't have moved him out of the way. His exhaustion was so extreme. As he cleaned his teeth, he took the time to check the grooves of his neck in the mirror. Though it was still caked with mud, he wanted to ensure no cuts had appeared in his creases. He didn't pay much attention to his heaping training, but he knew that small cuts from rusted scrap were an easy way to get an infection. As he checked, he had to move his face to a different spot of the partially broken mirror. It was missing a piece in the bottom right corner and had an intricate weave of cracks stemming from the gap. After he confirmed there were no wounds, he turned and faced the shower, which was on the wall opposite of the mirror. If the tile and glass chamber had taken up any more space in the room, Dorvin would have to wedge himself between it and the sink just to see the mirror. The water supply, which was nothing more than a blue barrel of water sitting against the outer wall, only made the contraption seem bulkier. He entered the shower and turned the knob affixed to the wall. The sound of the pump activating triggered once more, but this time the feeling of water over his head was a welcome relief. It reminded Dorvin that he needed to thank Tira for building the contraption, but he was reminded of this every time he used it, and often forgot. He'd simply thank her this time and absolve his guilt by picking up the garments he had previously ignored. It was relaxing moments like these that had also made him understand her cleaning compulsion. He watched with satisfaction as the mud ran from his skin, as he scrubbed the creases of his hexes. He was just about to turn the spigot off when he realized that blood was running towards the drain. It was what remained of the dried cut on his left hand, an injury he had obtained from Grit during their time together during the heap. When he was checking for his cuts in the mirror a few moments prior, he was trying to pretend this one didn't exist. Furthermore, he didn't want to explain the cut to the pink Lloyd he called partner. The thought of it was tough to ignore now that he had seen the blood, but he managed to brush off the lingering sting and finish his business. A moment later, he returned to the lab room with a fresh black vest and bright red river. Tira was rooting through those bits of scrap left on the top of the open save. Announcing his presence, however, would mean that he would have to stop letting his addiction win and stop gawking. He looked at her fiery hair and how it draped across the front of her body, getting tangled in the straps of her blue overalls. It seemed to point his eyes at her full chest, which was partially revealed in the dip of her white tank top, which she wore under the overalls. How could she remain so beautiful working as a heaping RE? Questioned Dorvin to himself, noting that her breasts were untouched by any hexagonal tessellation. He knew from many years of experience that Tira, like most women, had a pattern. What would her pattern look like? He wondered. Suddenly, his brain was descending a path of matching the patterns he had seen to Tira's pink skin and white glow. The first that came to mind was a woman he had met in the Scrapper's Lounge. She had X-shaped breaks that laid over top of her breasts and crossed just above the belly button. However, this seemed too edgy for Tira's proper nature. The second one he thought of was a Heaper he had met a few weeks back. She had 2 stripes that stretched from the breast to the front of her pelvis in perfect lines. This would fit Tira's organized personality, but still seemed completely incorrect. It wouldn't match the color of her glow, and it would look overly symmetrical in combination with the 2 hexagonal dimples on her face. Ahem, interrupted Tira. Dorvan's eyes shifted from the large breasts to Tira's face. She'd caught him staring. Sorry, T, said Dorvan, a sly smile on his face once more. Tira moved from the central table, with long strands of insulated wire in her hand. She was creating a power cable, using the scraps Dorvan had salvaged. I am not a scrapper girl, Dorvan. You can blow your share by staring at them in the cozy. In here we act as professionals. Is that what Not the Code has dubbed you? Is cable high in value right now? Asked Dorvan, trying to change the subject. He wanted to defend himself, but she had caught him staring so many times at this point that it wasn't worth lying. Moderately, for an area with low scrap demand. Apparently, Tira also wanted to change the subject. Well, then it's a good thing I brought these tabs back. The confident and charismatic Heaper made it a point to take up as much space as possible. He sat down at the lab station and kicked his feet up onto the surface. Perhaps it was to compensate for his short stature. His hands fell behind his head, mimicking the stereotypical pose that senders struck in film. Such simple emotes were ingrained into the culture of Fragmenta at this point. As I said, we can go anywhere you want. Honestly, I'm surprised you want to go. Isn't eco-law, like, your thing? Not exactly, Dorvan. Law is important, but so is advancement in the system. The organization in this city thinks that because trash droid clusters have avoided this area, they can pay less for equally good components. That is why I want to move north. Eco is known to pay Heapers more than Filament. According to star alignment, the trash droid clusters should begin landing there in the coming months. Plus, I am not abandoning the code, simply relocating. Trash droids are bogus, Tira. I think companies that pay more for trash droid heaps are ruining this occupation, and in my professional opinion, that makes it beat shit. He opened the plastic bag next to where Tira was working and began counting the tabs out on the counter. Look at you being political, she replied sarcastically. Regardless of it being beat shit, we have to advance our careers somehow. We will be walking over old, profitless trash in this crawler forever if we are not proactive. Old trash, new trash, trash trash. I'm gonna make a shirt that says that so all the coders out there can know that it's all trash and it doesn't make a fucking difference. Dorvan, at least give it a thought. I've heard rumors of heaps that are large enough to set you for life. If we could just be there. I'm calling beat shit, Dorvan interrupted, causing her to jump. Eco gets to that shit way before Heapers. In fact, isn't it true that no Heaper has ever claimed a trash droid for themselves? Well, I think that it is not beat shit. I have to remain hopeful that I will become successful one day. Regardless, I could use a change in scenery. The Moteres Mesa is not exactly beautiful of this time of year. Fair enough, accepted Dorvan. Filament in the Basura Mountains, here we come. We'll cash it on this heap and get some supplies tomorrow. But for now, he pushed a pile of tabs toward her. We rest. 70-30. Consider this a repayment on what I owe. Partial, she said, reaching for a drawer under the counter. There, a notebook with tattered pages was counting Dorvan's debt. She flipped through it, found the correct page, and grabbed a pen from the front pocket of her overalls. To Dorvan, the new number was just as daunting as the previous one. You're too organized for your own good, Tira. Makes you look like such a coder. Dorvan got up, began toward his quarters. Organization has given me the ability to keep exact track of the money you owe. Coder or not, you still owe me 480 tabs. He began to close the door behind him, but was stopped by Tira's sudden change in tone. Wait, she interjected. Once Dorvan stopped at the door, she asked, Why are there components you brought back covered in blood? Oh, I tried to clean them off before I got back, but I must have missed one. I scratched my hand pulling a piece of scrap free. It's just a cut, Tira. You worry too much for your own good. Are you sure this has nothing to do with your sudden approval of moving north? You can trust me, T, replied Dorvin, avoiding the question. Flashes of her face haunted him, even after he closed the door, but again, the guilt was no match for his exhaustion. He fell asleep the moment he closed his eyes, and once again, he was forced to dream of his past. It was a past he so desperately wished to forget. Nights of eternal torment, he heard his mother say in some corner of his mind. You will be of his touch. You will sacrifice your glow. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or the dream, but he woke after what only felt like moments. As he stirred, a quake of his room returned him to the fully alert state. Heart pounding, he sat up from his plastic hammock and looked out of his small circular port. He was greeted with a sigh of relief as he realized that the shaking was coming from the moving crawler. Underneath the shuttle, the long crab-like legs reached outward towards the scrap and plunged into it deeply, causing trash to topple off the piles down below. As the room continued to rumble, Dorvin took in the sight of the desert, not believing that morning had already come. The Moteri's mesa was a shithole in Dorvin's eyes. However, its scrap had kept him alive for quite some time. When he had escaped the canyon, he was certain that Fragmenta was his permanent home, but now he had no choice. The debts he owed to the grease knives were too great, and they would surely be hunting him down. What am I going to tell Tira? He thought, remembering how he had dodged her question about the blood. If I tell her that Grit had tried to take the tabs, and things went south, she will leave me alone. He struggled to find his feet in the quaking room as he dropped from the hammock. More than anything, he did not want her to leave. Sure, he had other friends in Fragmenta, but they had no ties to the mess he had created. The fear of the word alone was more than enough reason not to tell her, but he was fully aware that it was a selfish reason. Dorvin began spiraling, desperately reaching for a justifiable reason to keep last night's heaping run a secret. She wouldn't get away, he realized suddenly. They'll hunt her for a connection with me. If she doesn't come, she'll be in danger too. Dorvin only thought for a moment more before he decided that his reasoning was sound enough. His decision was completed with a feeling that was equal parts guilt and regret. He tried to forget about the secret that he was keeping, and continued to absorb the mesa. Scuttling and mining, crawlers covered its surface, though the legs of most of them were the same as their crawler. The capsules were made of all sorts of different abandoned vehicles. Most of the wasteland just outside Fragmenta was controlled by the grease knives. As a result, their crawlers were easy to pick out from the herd. They were built with armored green sender vehicles that were inefficient in space but physically imposing. Based on the scrap that Dorvin had found around these vehicles, he gathered that they were some sort of war machine on the sender's planet. In the distance, past the crawlers, he saw Fragmenta illuminating the green sky, growing closer. He turned his attention from the window and began searching his room for the day's supplies. His quarters didn't have much besides his clothes, which were an old tool chest in the corner, and his sender collection, which was housed on a metallic shelf against the wall. The collection itself was a random assortment of things that Dorvin found interesting. One of these items was a plastic baseball player with a detached head. It was sloppily reconnected to the body with a rusted spring and rocked along with the shaking room. Dorvin, who was easily amused by such gimmicks, smiled when he looked at it. He moved closer to it, observing its tone and nothing more. The tone of the senders was something that he had always found strange. Beside his own brown skin tone, the senders' muted, fleshy faces were far different from the vibrant colors of his species. To remind him of how different they were, he kept old papers, books, and magazines that he had found scattered amongst the rubble. They were stored on the shelf just beside the bobbing head. He picked up one of the magazines and studied the greenery depicted behind them. It was then that he remembered why their tone was beautiful. Though they were bland, he found that their various browns, tans, and whites contrasted beautifully with the vibrant greens of their worlds. The sight of those plants made him understand why they wanted to rid their world of the scrap. The shelf also displayed wildlife models from the sender's planet. Dorvin found that their animals were widely diverse, and wondered if there used to be similar creatures on Contaminos. The long-necked yellow creature with brown spots was his favorite, He had no concept of how large this beast was or what it ate, but he gathered that the long neck was to get plants from the top of the trees. So, to capture this artistically, he placed a small clay tree, which was chipped on the side, next to the creature. The thought of seeing trees on Contaminos was a dream he could only wish for. They were non-existent in the mesa, but Heapers from the north told him they did exist. Disappointment filled him when he learned that they were not green and vibrant like he had imagined. Dorvin glanced around the rest of the creatures on the shelf. He quickly noted the horned figure that depicted the bison. He had learned the name of this from a book he had found during a heap. The green-coiled snake was one he also knew about. Contaminos had various types of serpents on its surface, and were especially feared amongst the Heapers. Finally, he picked up and examined the figure depicting an 8-legged beast with fangs. How can so many eyes exist on one beast? He wondered. On the bottom of it, he read the name Bill. He was unsure if the name of the creature was Bill, or if Bill had made the model. Either way, the thought of a creature named Bill was very unintimidating. He placed Bill down and walked carefully out of the lab. There, Tira was controlling the crawler with the rewired buttons on the wall next to the entrance. The door itself was hanging open, and Tira was scanning the horizon of scrap as she steered. Her blue overalls blew heavily with the wind, and her long red hair followed the motion of the cloth. She turned for a moment to see Dorvin standing in the doorway of his quarters. She smiled at him and said, "One final stop in Fragmenta, Dorvin. I will sell what I can at the Scrap Forge Tower, and we will make our journey north in the morning." Dorvin stretched out and returned the smile with a tired expression. "Oh, I guess I'll grab some supplies at the Scrapper's Lounge." Tira rolled her eyes and turned back to the opening. Dorvin could have sworn she said something under her breath, but he couldn't hear in the rustling wind.